All right. Good day, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And a special thank you to Calypso Farm and Ecology Center and the Folk School in Alaska for hosting today's conversation. For all of you that are in the audience, thank you for being here. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to drop them in the chat. We're going to have time for Q&A at the end, and we'll make sure to be monitoring the chat to answer all of your questions. I would like to begin by acknowledging the communities and nations whose land my work is taking place on, and invite participants to consider where their own work and life takes place. For me, this includes the Coast Salish peoples, specifically the Clown and the Chimacum, and many other indigenous communities and persons from across the Olympic Peninsula who meet here. It is important to me to ground this gathering in the recognition of the historical and ongoing process of colonization. Again, I just want to thank everyone for being here. Thank you for taking your time to spend the day with us or the afternoon with us. Thank you to Natalie and Jim for being here. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the chat, and we will be sure to answer those questions later on in the conversation. I would like to welcome our two amazing guests today. We have Natalie Bazil and Jim Embry. Natalie is the author of Queen Sugar, which has been adapted for television and co-produced by Ava DuVernay and Oprah Winfrey. Her new nonfiction book, We Are Each Other's Harvest, celebrating African-American farmers, land, and memory, is forthcoming and being released on April 6th of this year. And Jim, he is the great-grandson of formerly enslaved small farmers and often labeled as Black and Green. Jim considers himself stardust congealed in a human form that represents billions of years of Earth's evolution. He is the founder and director of Sustainable Communities Network and a leader in various social movements seeking to contribute to the theory and practice of sustainable living at the local, national, and international levels with a focus on food and agriculture systems. So welcome both of you.
Thank you.
Be here. Thank you.
Yeah. All right, well, I'm gonna get started here. I would like to share with y'all a story of how I met both these wonderful people. I'm gonna start with Natalie. Natalie, I had the opportunity to meet when she was collecting stories for this book. We had just missed each other in Washington when she was on residency at Hedgebrook, and which happened to be just a short drive away from where I was farming at the time. But I had just traveled to Alaska to spend the summer with Calypso Farm. And Natalie, she may not be aware of this, but when I invited her to Alaska, I did think she was gonna come because it's Alaska. It's like, kind of not here or close to the connected 48 states. And but she did come, and it has been such an amazing honor and privilege to have this growing friendship with this amazing woman. Natalie, thank you so much for being here. Do you want to start by telling us a little bit about this book, We Are Each Other's Harvest, and how it came about and the journey to this book?
Sure, absolutely. And Mel, I just have to say, thank you so much for inviting me, and thanks to Christy and all the people at Calypso who welcomed me when I, came up there. And we're just such warm and gracious hosts. And also thank you for introducing me to Jim. I really appreciate all of your, just your generosity of spirit. You have been a wonderful friend, and this book is a great celebration, I think. So I'll share the copy of the Advance Galley. The book comes out on April 6th, so just about 2 weeks away, but this is the advance copy. This is the hard or the soft cover. And I really love it because it conveys everything that I'd hoped to convey about this book. We Are Each Other's Harvest is really an anthology that celebrates and elevates the stories and voices of Black farmers primarily, and other farmers of color. And after writing Queen Sugar, which was a novel, and kind of living in the world of living in the world of farmers and trying to tell the story through the lens of fiction and trying to explore a lot of the issues and questions that Black farmers were facing, I felt like my work was not done, because as pleased as I was with the novel and then, the adaptation for television, when I was offered an opportunity to do a nonfiction book, right? When I thought about it, I thought, I want these farmers and people of color, Black people who are involved with agriculture, I want to give them a chance to speak for themselves and tell their own stories, right? Because as I began to kind of look around and think about the diversity of experience all across the country, I felt like I could not do that work, right? My job is as a novelist, as a storyteller, but you all are the people who are doing the work every day and showing up. And so I really wanted to use whatever platform I had as the author of a book that celebrated, Black people in agriculture and Black people in farming. I wanted to use that platform to really continue to expand the conversation and let Black farmers speak for themselves. So We Are Each Other's Harvest is an anthology. It's a collection of first-person narratives like yours. It's a collection of essays like Jim's, who bring a wonderful perspective. It's historical pieces. It is essays or articles that I either commissioned or acquired the rights to that have something to do with this constellation of issues around Black people and land ownership. But then it's also portraits and photographs and poems even. So really think of it as a chorus of voices. That's my long, short description of what this book is.
That's so beautiful. I love that, a chorus of voices. Well, Natalie, I remember when we connected in Alaska and you were still trying to figure out what the title of this book was going to be called. And at that time, it was very early on the production of this book. So how did you, do you want to speak to the title of the book and where that inspiration came from?
Absolutely. So you're right. When I came up to Alaska, I was really kind of casting about for a title that captured the feeling that I had about the history of people of color, Black people on the land. And I wanted a title that would be celebratory and that would convey a past, but also a future. And I wanted it to be uplifting and inspirational. And so We Are Each Other's Harvest is actually the last line of a Gwendolyn Brooks poem called, I think it's called Paul Robeson. And the last line of this poem reads, "We are each other's harvest, we are each other's business, we are each other's magnitude and bond." And when I had the whole manuscript kind of laid out on the table, after I gathered all the stories, I had that as one of the little sayings that I was going to include. And one day I just happened to look at it and it's like I saw it with new eyes when I thought, holy cow, this is it. This is the title, because it captured that sense of community and history and, just all of it. It just said it all. So that's where the title came from.
Thank you. Oh, that's such a beautiful, beautiful visual. Do you want to share any stories in the book? Would you like to do a reading?
I will do a very brief reading, very brief. And this is actually from, since you're you and it's at Calypso, I just want to read just the very beginning of your story before you begin to really speak for yourself in this. Okay, so there's a beautiful portrait of you, which I will not spoil. I'll let readers see that. And then your chapter is called 4 Days in Alaskan Farm School, Melony Edwards, Calypso Farm and Ecology Center, Esther, Alaska. And this is the way it begins. In her Instagram post, Melony Edwards hoists a 20-pound Chigoya beet onto her shoulders. And this is the way I actually saw you and came across you the first time. She hoists this beet onto her shoulders. The vegetable is larger than Melony's face, and its mass and stems and oversized leaves sprouting from its top match the bunch of braids gathered with an elastic band on the top of her head. Wearing a gray fleece and white sunglasses, Melony kneels in the dirt. Acres of leafy green stretch into the distance. The caption reads, "We grow beets this big and that are not woody and grow big from the result of love," in capital letters. Melony was one of the first young Black farmers I came across. She was wrapping up a 3-year stint at Willowwood Farm of Ebry's Prairie on Whidbey Island off the coast of Seattle. She'd soon be heading to Alaska to attend farm school on a learning sabbatical. It's 2 p.m. on a drizzly June afternoon when my flight touches down in Fairbanks. Dressed in overalls and rubber boots, her hair in 5 braids that fall past her shoulders, Melony waits for me in baggage claim. She leads me outside through the sliding doors where the gray sky hangs low and the air is heavy with the acrid smell of wood burning. For the last 2 weeks, wildfires have raged across Alaska. Evacuation alerts have been issued for parts of Fairbanks. We toss my luggage into the back of her VW Jetta wagon and strike out for Calypso Farm and Ecology Center. 1 month ago, Melony traveled to Fairbanks from Seattle, a distance of more than 2,900 miles. From Whidbey Island, she headed north to Bellingham, Washington, where she boarded the Alaska Marine Highway Ferry. Her aunt had generously purchased the $1,500 ferry ticket, but the additional $500 for a private cabin was beyond Melony's budget. And so for 3 days, she tent camped on the windswept outer deck as the ferry navigated Alaska's inner passage. She disembarked in Haines, Alaska, and drove the 12 hours, crossing the Yukon and stopping occasionally to photograph moose tracks, snow-capped mountains, and placid glacier lakes. And I'll stop there. So there's just a little bit more of me kind of setting up your story, and then it's your lovely voice and telling the story of your own journey into farming. So
that's so awesome. Oh my gosh, like I have like tears in my eyes. I'm like, I can't believe you captured all of that. That was amazing.
Well, Melony, it was such a pleasure to, spend those 4 days with you and really just follow you around and ask questions and cook together and watch you do these amazing things at Calypso. I mean, from the machinery that you were using to the log cabin that you built on my last day, to the wool you were spinning. I mean, I had a great time. It was so fun to be there with you and just learn from you and the folks at Calypso. And I'm just so grateful that you all extended such a warm welcome to me and that I was able to include your story in this book. So I just can't wait for you to see it.
I had so much fun with you. It was such an amazing week. I wish you could have stayed longer. I mean, like you even had to learn how to like keep your cabin warm with the wood fire stove. And it was such a great kind of like, what do you call it? Just off the grid experience. It was really amazing. Yeah. Thank you so much for that. So Natalie, this book is out and it's like, it's gaining a lot of traction, and I'm just really excited about sharing this story in any capacity that I can. Like, what's next? Like, what is your next writing journey going to look like? What is your next story that you're going to tell? What are you hoping for the future?
Look, I'll kind of answer it in reverse. Really, what I'm hoping to do in the short term, I want every farmer in this book, every voice in this book, everybody who contributed an essay, I want this book to elevate and amplify their stories so that readers and people who might not be thinking about farming really understand the journey that African Americans have been on. In addition to Native and Indigenous farmers, Latinx farmers, I hope that this book helps shift the narrative around who is engaged in these farming practices. And I want to widen the lens on that and really just celebrate all of these amazing people who have been doing this work forever. So that is my most immediate goal. It's just to share these stories and remind people about the beauty of agriculture and all that it can mean for people of color. So.
And you have a book tour coming up, is that correct? Like a virtual book tour coming up?
I do, yeah. I have some other events on the calendar starting on April 6th. You can look at my Instagram that has a lot of the links. There are other virtual book talks where I'm in conversation with people from the book or people who contributed. I had the amazing Dr. Monica White of Freedom Farmers, who wrote that book, who is going to be in conversation with me at Karis Books. This is virtual. You're going to be with me later on next month at the Center for Fiction with another one of the farmers. So there are some other events that are coming up that allow me to, share the spotlight with the people who helped make this book happen.
Thank you. Well, we'll post links to Natalie's website. So if any of you want to join any of those book tours, virtual book tours, you'll be able to have access to that. Christy, if you don't mind putting that in the chat, that would be very helpful. Well, thank you, Natalie. I want to pass it over to Jim. I'm so excited to introduce Jim. I first met him at BUGS, which is the Black Farmers and Urban Gardeners Conference in 2018 in North Carolina. We ran into each other at a cash-only beverage concession where I didn't have any cash, and he offered to purchase the item for me. It was then where we struck up a conversation about my proximity to another conference, the Biodynamic Conference that was taking place in Oregon. And he happened to be speaking at it. He made it possible for me to receive a scholarship to attend, and I learned of his amazing family farming history and their connection to George Washington Carver. Jim is a constant inspiration to me. And when Natalie was visiting Alaska, I told her about Jim's work and that the book would not be complete without his story. And I'm so grateful that the two of you were able to connect. Jim, thank you for being here. I thank you so much for taking time to be here. Will you start by kind of just sharing with us about your farming journey and maybe like your family history? I think you have such like a very unique history, and I'm so happy that you have that knowledge of your family history in farming.
Yes. Well, thank you, Melanie, for making this connection with Natalie. And thank you, Natalie, for inviting me to be a part of this really wonderful book project that in our view is going to be one of the most important books of this year. There's so much conversation going on around equity and justice. And just yesterday, we were part of this USDA hearing about Black farmers. And as we all sat there and listened, I'm sure we all thought, well, hey, let's get this book in the hands of these House and Senate members and Secretary Vilsack and so forth. But let me begin by, I'm sitting here in my house on this land that's a family farm that goes back to around 1890 in our family. But our farm sits at the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. It's bathed by the Kentucky River, and it's nourished by the soil heavily mineralized with limestone. This area where our community of folk came to after the Civil War was also land that was inhabited for thousands of years by the indigenous Cherokee and Shawnee people. And fortunately, this land has been in our family again since around 1890. So I come out of this, what I call this agrarian, intellectual, activist family culture. So what I speak about and what I have been working on is based upon a foundation of a family and community culture that goes back again to when we first were brought over here from Virginia, let's say, around 1800 or so. Let me say that to the book title again, just echoing Natalie's words, what a marvelous title that connects past, present, and future, that accumulates all these diverse voices in various ways, whether it's essays, articles, photographs, poems. And this poem, when I came across the title and read about it, I knew Gwendolyn Brooks from my activist days in the Black Power movement and the Black cultural renaissance movement of the 60s and 70s, visited with her numerous times in Chicago at the Third World Press. That was back when Don L. Lee, before becoming Haki Madhubuti, was kind of directing Third World Press. And of course, she came to Lexington as well, to Howard University. So I was just honored to be in that spirit circle of someone like Gwendolyn Brooks and Paul Robeson, who in my view, as human beings, we're all trees. We all have a role to play in absorbing nutrients and then giving fruit. We're all trees, but Paul was like a sequoia tree. I mean, like, wow, his footprint was huge. So I'm just honored again to be a part of that kind of a spirit circle that this title represents. I mean, I also add, before I get into my story, is that when we look at, if I can show again, this book front cover. Okay, now here you've got Naima and Leah Penniman on the front cover. No better front cover, in my view, that represents this title, We Are Each Other's Harvest. You've got these strong, powerful images of two Black women saying, we are claiming or reclaiming this connection with the land, with this sacred medium that we're all made from. That image, I think, Natalie, is to me is similar to that iconic Rosie the Riveter, okay, about women in the industrial workplace, where here, I mean, their arms are buffed up, okay? So there's some play with that, okay? But also, that image reminded me, as a segue into my family history, reminded me of this chapter in the Bible in Isaiah that talks about the idea of taking swords and having them turn into plowshares. So I think about my own family history, and I think about that in our family, we had three great grandfathers that fought in the Civil War, part of what's called the U.S. colored troops. Some of them were in the artillery, shooting off cannons. Some carried rifles, and some of them carried swords, okay? But our three great granddads, when we look at their military history, list their occupation, it says farmers, okay? And by and large, those 200,000 plus Black men and Black women that fought in the Civil War were farmers, okay? They were farmers. So here you had this legal armed insurrection, okay, of Black men and women fighting for our freedom and also for the reunification of the states. Without this introduction of 200,000 plus fighters, soldiers, we probably wouldn't be where we are today. So we owe, if you will, a lot to these men and women who fought in the Civil War. So again, we had three who fought in the Civil War, and two of them were brothers, as this image, not quite them, but shows. And one of the brothers died in the Civil War, and his wife, who was my great-great-grandmother, was left as a single parent, talk about single parents, with 7 children, okay? And because she survived, I'm here today speaking with you all, okay? And she went on again to, after the Civil War, she kind of came back to where she was enslaved. And then she encouraged her children to be educated, sent them off to school, to college as well, to Berea College. They became teachers and small farmers and things like that. And then one of her children, who was my great-grandfather, again, he went in 1879 with her encouragement, okay? Can you imagine this woman who we say probably was illiterate, couldn't read or write, but knew to encourage her children, her son, to go to college? So he did so, and he went there in 1879, came out after 2 years, became a school teacher, a farmer, blacksmith, you know, a butcher, all kinds of things. But he joined in with the various Black teacher associations. He joined in with the Black Farmer Cooperative that was organized by a guy named Henry Allen Lane. And now these folks, okay, this Black Farmer Cooperative, this Black Teacher Association in 1915 hosted here in Richmond, Kentucky, the small town, back in 1915 of about 5,000 people population, okay? But they hosted what's called a covered Chautauqua event, a whole weekend of educational seminars, events, speakers, and so forth that drew 1,500 people to Richmond, Kentucky. They came from Lexington, a nearby city, 20 miles away, Cincinnati, Louisville, Kentucky, where again, homage and respect to Breonna Taylor, which is another topic for a conversation, but also from Chicago, Detroit, coming to Lexington, coming to Richmond. You say, well, why is always Black folk coming to Richmond? Because the speakers were the likes of Mary Church Terrell, Ida B. Wells, W.B. Du Bois, and George Washington Carver. Now, these folks came again in 1919, okay? They invited them back again. He coming back was Du Bois, Mary Church Terrell, George Washington Carver, back to Richmond in 1919. Now, if we recall our history of our country, that was called Red Summer, named by James Weldon Johnson, who was, as we know, was a political activist and author, and also worked at that time for the NAACP. That was when some 40 cities around the country were being just devastated by white vigilantes, white supremacist groups, going into neighborhoods, killing folk, lynching people, running them up literally, and getting them out of the city. Red Summer. So you say, well, gee, how could these folks here in Richmond, you know, manage to have this Chautauqua with all these Black folk during Red Summer? So that's just some of the stories and some of the images of the family and the culture that I come out of. Again, so I'm kind of doing, I say that I don't know any better, okay? I don't know any better. My family culture was about activism from the Civil War, post the Civil War. Great-granddad who got put off a bus in the 30s, 20 years before the Rosa Parks sit down, along with my mother, members of CORE, and so forth. So I'm just kind of like following in their footsteps. And it's an honor for me again to be here with you fantastic folks, okay, at this session today. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Well, I remember when we did meet at the Biodynamic Conference and you gave a compelling story about your family connection to the great George Washington Carver. And you talked about all of his amazing contributions to agriculture, science, and education and spirituality. And I know that that is a huge component that guides your work today. Do you want to speak to some of the significance that George Washington Carver has on agriculture? And I always like to mention, and you mentioned this too, I always like to mention how George Washington Carver did a lot of work with the USDA and specifically around like victory gardens. And I feel like that's something that a lot of people are not familiar with. But please share your perspective and stories.
Yes, absolutely. So again, so my great grandfather, and it could be that where I'm sitting now in this house on this land might have been a place where Carver or Du Bois or Mary Church Terrell might have slept, because back in those days, you couldn't go to the Marriott and you couldn't go to the hotels. You stayed in people's homes. Okay, so our land and our culture here, community culture, might have been a place where these folks actually stayed. I recall my mom talking about, yeah, well, great granddad, was always reading those farmer bulletins. I realize now they were the 40-some bulletins that Carver had written over his tenure at Tuskegee. Okay, he authored and did the drawings for some 44 bulletins that all are relevant today. Many of the questions around food justice, organic farming, permaculture, composting, food justice, food sovereignty, he was addressing both in his bulletins, but also he had what's called a Jessup wagon. Like it was like first a horse or a mule-drawn wagon that was motorized, where he would travel all over Alabama, reaching out to all the black farmers and white farmers throughout Alabama in the South. So so he was regarded by the USA's top, say, scientists like Edison, like the industrialist Henry Ford. They regarded him as the most prominent scientist of that era, not just Black scientists, the most prominent scientists of that era. But he contributed so many ideas of like extension, taking a Jessup wagon and going to the people. Okay, he wrote these bulletins at the level that the common people could understand. So many things today that are written by the ag schools and whatever else are fine if you're an academic and you've got advanced degrees, but aren't written oftentimes for grassroots people and common farmers. Okay, but so idea of quantum thinking, they were all from the same source, we're all interconnected. That's how Carver lived, that we're all interconnected. One of his quotes is that as we do it to the soil injustice, that also is an injustice to the people and to the farmers. You can't separate these things as oftentimes we do. But he was friends with all the presidents of his era, all the Roosevelts, okay, all the folks, he was friends with them. As you were saying, he contributed, he kind of put forward the idea of the victory gardens. One of his first bulletins, written back in 1898, had to do with nature study and school gardens. He believed that every school, every faith institution, every church, every temple, every synagogue ought to have a garden. Okay. Now we're talking about school garden movements around the country. He was already writing about that in 1898. He also put forward the idea, because he had some good friends who were working in the USDA with the idea of victory gardens. If we look at some of those posters of victory gardens, it's mostly, white women, white men, white children, marching with flags and whatever. But Carver kind of began putting that idea forward way back in the 1890s. He was friends with Mahatma Gandhi, for example. Gandhi had heard about this black guy over in Alabama, Tuskegee, okay, that's writing all this great stuff and talking about, this small scale farmers and peasant farming that we're involved in here in India, Gandhi was saying. But Gandhi was fasting, and they corresponded several times, and Gandhi asked him for some advice on how just to tweak and maybe perfect his plant-based diet, okay? Carver was talking about healthy diet, talking about canning, preserving, and things like that. And because Carver knew Gandhi, then Carver was friends with a guy named Howard Thurman and his wife Kate, who went to Asia, went to India to meet with Gandhi. And Carver sent a message by Howard Thurman to Gandhi. Howard came back. He was good friends with Benjamin Mays, who was good friends with Dr. King's father. And by virtue of that kind of, if you want to call it, us harvesting these vibrations, then King began to adopt the nonviolent Gandhian philosophy that goes back to Carver and goes up to our late John Lewis. I mean, so many of the answers, in my view, if we as a nation had followed after Carver died, what he was laying out, talking about simple living, zero waste. He and Ford, there's a book that's out about the green vision of Carver and Ford. They talked about pretty much building all they could of the automobile from products raised on farms. Carver understood that if we're going to allow Black farmers and now all farmers to survive, be viable, to be sustainable, we got to find ways, not just selling, which is all great, not just selling farm products, but how do we use farm products to actually build the infrastructure, the cars and whatever else that we're talking about. So if we had followed those kinds of visions, then we wouldn't be here today talking about these questions of food justice, food sovereignty, and things like that. But we didn't. So now I encourage people to go back and pick up his bulletins, go back and read his writings, his letters, go visit Tuskegee. He has 2 federal monuments named for him. Just pick up his ideas and find ways to incorporate those ideas, those principles within your life.
Thank you, Jim. That's beautiful. Jim, I want to also give you a little bit of time. Do you want to do a brief reading of your essay? I don't know how long the reading is, but maybe if you have time to read the whole one or a portion of it.
Yes, I will make it short, and I will say I encourage everyone who's listening in, who's watching in now and in the future, to get your pre-order in, okay? Get your pre-order in for Natalie's book, get it sent to you, send it a copy to your friends, to your family, to your faith institution, to your university, whatever else. Get that book and make it a part of your life. Now, what I want to do, since it is Women's History Month, is to pay homage to my great-great-grandmother, Elizabeth. And as I was writing this essay, Natalie, at the times had to put it down, okay? Because I was trying to channel my great-great-grandmother and what she endured. Again, Civil War ended, her husband died in the war. She's got 7 children from 14 years old to 1 year old. So she couldn't leave like many Black women did, leaving out of here, going to Kansas, like Nicodemus, Kansas, followed by Black women out of Kentucky, largely the Pearl Clay wrote about in her book, Flying West. She had to come back to where she was enslaved. And she endured some things. I'm sure she did, because she came back to an area that was a Confederate stronghold. I'm sure she heard many times by white folks, yeah, that colored girl over there, her husband fought in the war, okay, that we lost. We're gonna make life tough for her. We're gonna do all kinds of things to harass her. So I had a tough time trying to remain focused and get this essay to Natalie in the time. So I want to just read my attempt to channel her voice as she was encouraging her son, my great-grandfather, D.B. Ballou, to go to college at what's called Berea College, the first college in the South to admit women and African Americans in 1855. Now, children, your daddy ain't here no more, but we got to hold on to each other and find our way. Remember that nice white man, John Fee, who was at Camp Nelson when we were there educating colored women, colored men, colored children? Well, I hear he got a school over in Berea that allows colored folks to attend. So, in honor of your daddy, who fought and died in the war for us to be free, I want you to go to that school so you can teach and help other colored folks.
Thank you.
That's my reading.
I got chills.
Here, same here.
And I was also real quickly in the essay, I also took time to lift up my mother, who we had a sister named Marcia, who died in 1954 because of the hospitals in Richmond were segregated, and she had pneumonia. She had some attacks, and my parents, took her to the hospital, and they were told, well, y'all know you got here this white waiting room and a colored waiting room. Y'all go sit in there until we can get to you. And they waited too long, and our sister died. And my mother had what was called back then a nervous breakdown. And she came back to her family farm, okay, with her mother, and spent several weeks trying to heal from the trauma, this idea of racism and it being systemic and being violent in all kinds of ways. It's like a trauma that we're still healing from. So we recognize that the idea of Black farmers and land has to do with production and whatever, but also healing. It's a healing place. My mom came back here right near this where we're at now and healed from the trauma of losing her daughter, and then went on to become a civil rights leader with CORE and help, mentor me and so forth. So that's in the essay. And that was also a part that I had to put down a couple of times. But I thank Natalie for writing, said, well, Jim, is your essay about finished yet? Okay, when's it coming? Thank you.
My pleasure. My honor, Jim, really, really. It's a beautiful story. And you're you have such a command of history. I mean, I'm sitting here, I could just listen to you all day. It's just amazing.
Yeah. Well, again, my great-granddad, name is D.B. Ballou, who went to Berea College, was a great storyteller. He helped create the church right across from our farm here now, helped create the school down the road here. But he was like the family historian. He helped begin our family reunion in 1942, and then he passed that on to my mother as like the African griot, the griot that tells the story. And I recall when I was young, I would hear stories over and over again. I would tell my mom, I said, we heard that story already like 30 times. Hush up, boy, okay, hush up. Now I realize my sitting there and hearing it was because my work was to become then the family griot, the historian, and tell stories.
Amazing.
Thank you. It's amazing. All right, well, we're getting close to time. We've got about 15 minutes left, and there are a few questions in the chat, and then we'll see if we can get answers to some of these questions. And then Natalie and Jim, if you have any closing words. Also in the chat, I did put a link. If you take a look at the chat, I can put it in again if you haven't seen it, for bookstores of where you can pre-order Natalie's book, We Are Each Other's Harvest. And Natalie strongly recommends, if you can, please support Black-owned bookstores. And the link in the chat is a list of Black bookstores by state. And if you don't have one in your state, order it from another state. And if you can't do that, then try and shop from a local indie bookstore. So please, again, I'll put the link in the chat. Please get your books because it's coming out soon. And if it's anything like when Freedom Farmers came out, it sold out. I had to wait for the second round. So Jim, we do have a question in the chat, and it says, how can we access the papers Jim was referencing of George Washington Carver? What will we look for?
Okay, you can go to different sources. One, you can go to Tuskegee website. Has a whole library of Carver's writings, his speeches, his letters. It's available online. It's probably the best source at Tuskegee. You can also go, again, if you do a search for Carver and the federal parks. Again, there are 2 parks, federal parks, named in his honor. And there are also about 60 other federal parks that are named for or represent African-American individuals or culture, which you also check out. If you go to my website, which is sustainlex.org, I have several compilations of Carver's writings and whatever. And on there, in that compilation, I have links for all of his, again, 44 bulletins. But again, I would say go to Tuskegee University. That's where, again, Carver was there from 1896, 1943. He lived simply. He never got a raise, lived in a small apartment, okay? And he donated to the university about $30,000 to help begin the Carver Foundation and Museum. And he died there. He's buried there along with Booker T. Washington. You can't separate, in my view, Booker T. from George Washington. Matter of fact, the name Washington and middle name comes from Carver's homage, respect, and love for Booker T. Washington. So that might be helpful. But just go online and Google, and you'll find all kinds of wonderful information, new books, new writings about Carver, because again, when it comes to organic agriculture, we talk about Leopold and Rodell and whatever, and that's all fine. But Carver was doing this work back in the 1890s. He was, in some ways, he was advising folks not to follow this industrial ag with heavy chemicals kind of way of thinking and so forth. So.
Thank you, Jim. All right, we have a question for Natalie. It says, how did you find and pick the farmers you featured in your book? That's a great question. I was sending her a list of farmers, by the way.
Yeah, it really was, it was a very organic process. I met Melony, and Melony made some amazing suggestions, and so I would reach out to people. I worked with a guy who became a good friend of mine, who is actually, his name is Darrell Tenney, and he's actually the only Black crop insurance agent in the United States, helping Black people get their business affairs in order and making sure that they have crop insurance. And he worked with a lot of Black farmers. They tended to be larger scale farmers, Black farmers that are few, but they're there. But he really is on a personal mission to make sure that Black farmers and farmers of color have their business entities in place to protect themselves. Mm-hmm. So he introduced me to a lot of farmers. And then some, it was really just by Instagram, like Melony, as I started kind of going down that rabbit hole. and, finding out, seeing who she followed, or, it was just an organic process. And honestly, if I hadn't had to turn the book in, I could still be out there, finding people. And because there were a lot of voices that I only discovered after I had turned in the manuscript. And so there's some real leaders out there in this community who I was not able to include just because I had to turn in the manuscript and hadn't reached out to them yet. So maybe there's a We Are Each Other's Harvest 2.0 coming. I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. That was actually going to be a question I had, was if there was anyone's voices that you couldn't capture because of time and space and things like that.
Great.
And there was a question about the name of the insurance provider, if you could mention that again.
Yes, his name is Darrell, Darrell, Tenney, Tennie. And the name of his firm is the Tenney Group. They are in Knights, and you can Google them. And his website will come up, and they're in Knightsbridge or Nightendale, North Carolina. But if you need help, he will help you. He will give you that advice on taxes and business entities, all that stuff. Not just for Black farmers, really any farmer who needs that kind of help. He's wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you for that. We've got about 10 minutes left. I just want to say thank you again to both of you. Is there anything, Natalie or Jim, that you really want to share with people that maybe we haven't touched on yet? Maybe you can both do 5-minute closing remarks.
Jim,
Absolutely.
You want to go?
Yeah, sure will. Absolutely. Let me say that we're now facing at the USA-Mexican border this crisis around folks who are, we say, immigrants trying to cross the border. And I want to add that how the U.S. has domestically treated the indigenous people by stealing land and then stealing and taking African people from the continent over here to work the stolen land. This quest for land and labor was that foundational injustice that we're still dealing with today. It goes back to that kind of foundation based upon land and labor. But how we have dealt with people of color, poor people domestically, is how we have also transferred that same mentality, that same industrialized, imperialistic, exploitative framework internationally, has created that internationally these peasant farmers who can't earn a living anymore because of all this influx of this cheap foods from all these tariff agreements like NAFTA. I call it GRAFTA. So we ought to be able to see that this intersect of how we deal with Black farmers impacts every institution. We talk about racism being systemic. Yes, because of the foundation of it around this idea of land and labor. It impacts our courts, everything. So it's important to look at it not just a question of the conditions of Black farmers, but the conditions of our domestic policy, our domestic spending, how we deal with the Farm Bill, how we deal with the USDA, how we deal with things internationally, are based upon this condition. So in my view, if we improve, if we commit ourselves to these questions of reparations, these questions of equity, these questions of funding, respect, of culture, then we are then able to also impact other people, other countries. It's not just about improving the condition of Black farmers. It's how do we radically shift the framework, the mentality, the local, state, federal policies that impact us in this country and impact people globally. Now, last point, real quickly, is that some 12,000 years ago, women developed agriculture. And by doing so, it gave us what now we call modern human culture. All of our professions, all of our institutions that we have now today are based upon this question of somebody else growing food. And women, again, introduced that. So, but around the world, as we know, in many other countries, the farmers are mostly women. So for me, this book also is a way, not discounting men's role, okay, by any means, is a way of telling women in the USA, women around the world, don't let go of this sacred connection with the land, with agriculture, with farming, reclaim it, reestablish it, and become part of this this effort of transforming not just our country, but I call it this maturation of us as a species. This question of farming and land connection with land, water, air, and whatever is a sacred relationship. And part of our work is, as a human species, is to mature to become stewards of this wonderful planet Earth.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you. I know, like, how do you follow that?
What else is there to say? I mean, he's really said it all. He said it all. I mean, there's so many points that he's just made that really resonate with me. First of all, I'm in total agreement with you about this immigration question. Two of the farmers who I have in the book are two Latinx women, and the stories that they tell about their experiences as migrant laborers, and the resilience and the perseverance, I had to include them because, again, it's about changing the conversation around migration and who was here first and who's been doing this work, and really honoring their work and their stories. That's first. Second, I love what you said about the role of women. And I was talking to, this was just this week, I was talking to a Native American farmer up here in the Bay Area. And she is part of, her name is Rowan White. And Rowan is part of the Sierra Seed. And she's talking about rematriation, which I thought was such an interesting way, not patriation, but matriation. And so I think in closing, all I want to say is I really do feel so fortunate to be part of this, what feels like a very important moment where, like you were saying, Jim, if we think about, yes, Black farming and all of the challenges that Black farmers have faced, but if we really think about that as just almost like a metaphor for all of these larger issues and questions that affect us all, right? And it's how we will deal with addressing this injustice for people of color that we all will benefit from. And I just want to thank you for your wisdom and your just the expansiveness of your vision for what we need. And I just, again, feel very fortunate to just be able to add my little voice, at a moment when I think we are really at a tipping point as we reconsider a lot of these important questions. So, but you said it. You did it.
Thank you, Natalie. There is one more question from a person, from Brittany, who is a master's student, and they're doing their dissertation on Black food sovereignty. And they said how events like this help them ground them in most work and the most important aspects of this work. And then they ask, in your opinion, what do you see as the most important area to focus on in continuing this work? Hold on, wait, let me go back a little bit. It says, sharing and documenting stories and histories around Black farmers in the U.S. In your opinion, what do you see as the most important areas to focus on in continuing this work?
Natalie.
I mean, wow, so many. Well, I think, okay, so what? I think looking at issues on the economic side, right, about access to capital and how essential that is for farmers of color to be able to get the support, the financial support that they need to continue doing their work, right? I think that that's essential. I think some of the indigenous farm practices that people are starting to, that I know Calypso already uses, that Soulfire uses, right? And I think about like how to scale that up, right? So that it's not only the smaller farmer who is going back to these sustainable practices, but how we can kind of bridge this gap and have conversations with, traditional farmers who, for all sorts of reasons, are locked into systems of farming that are hurting the planet, but that might be open, I think, to different practices if they can just get out from under some of the economic pressures that they're under. So there are lots, and I mean, I don't know. There's so many so many issues to consider, but those are two of the ones that come to mind.
Yeah. I would add that 500 years ago in Europe, we were given this way of thinking called Newtonian Cartesian view of the world, of the earth being a machine, the earth being a source to be exploited, thinking based upon things being separate, dichotomized, disconnected. That way of thinking has guided us for 500 years, and we're taught that from K through 12, and all our universities teach that way of thinking, of things being separate. What's the highest hierarchy thinking of what's the best, what's the whatever. And what we need, and Carver was great about this, what we need is to finally adopt in our schools quantum thinking that's linked with indigenous cultural thinking. And we're all indigenous people. We've all have roots from indigenous cultures, but this idea of combining what I call quantum thinking and indigenous thinking, we're all from the same source, we're all interconnected. What we need isn't so much the same Newtonian view of the world, but this quantum indigenous view, that how do we create the sensibility of how all things are interconnected. And what we need is individuals, whether they're farmers, intellectuals, academics, who can think in integrated systems, who can think about the network, the framework, okay, that encompasses the earth, encompasses our culture. That's what we need, in my view, is that kind of more holistic, integrated view, okay, of thinking, not so much the thinking based upon Newtonian science. By the way, Einstein and Carver, okay, were also friends, and so he was hanging out with all these, all these folks. But we need to, I would say to the folks who here, get your university to teach current science, which is quantum science, not Newtonian science. Have them transform the curriculum, transform how we lay out universities and so forth, where we are then able to think in these ways that allows us to look at the whole system. The food system needs people who understand how the whole system operates. Otherwise, we wind up passing laws, creating policies that pretty much repeat the problems that we're trying to deal with in the first place, because we're not looking at how the whole system works. The whole system from the human level, the system from the system of the environment, of the ecology. That's what we need, that kind of thinking, which is a leap in our understanding.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you both and your time and insight and knowledge. This has been wonderful. Natalie, I can't wait to see the book. Jim, I can't wait to read your story. I'm so excited. Again, in the chat, Natalie's link is in the chat. So I'm just like, as we wrap up here, if y'all, I'm trying to find it so I can, Christy, do you still have the link? Oh, I found it. So I'm just gonna put this back in the chat again. If you want to see or join in on any of Natalie's virtual book tours, her link I just posted in the chat again.
And I'm putting that stuff up there as we speak. So if you get there and it's not there, circle back. So
yeah, and you could also check her out on Instagram. Do you want people to follow you on Instagram?
That's fine.
Okay,
that's
okay,
fine.
great. I should ask first, so sorry, but you could also follow her on Instagram, where she does post things as well. If you type her name into the search, Natalie Bazil, you'll be able to find her. I just want to say one thing, just really quickly. There was a great comment in here by Greg. It says composting the binary in regards to when Jim was talking about changing the science curriculum. So I just thought that was a really great comment. So thank you everyone so much. Natalie, I hope we cross paths again. Jim, I would love to come visit you in Kentucky sometime. So I hope we cross paths again as well. Thank you so much. Thank you again, Calypso Farm and the Folk School for hosting this conversation yet again. And for the rest of you who have joined us, please stay tuned as this conversation series continues. We'll have more amazing guest speakers and conversations moving forward.
Good job, Melony. Good work.
Thank you, Melanie.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim.
Love y'all. Love y'all.